Can't think of your last name. Sorry.
The start of allowing the board to understand what's the scale, what's the scope, that when the staff starts meeting in January, that they have to tackle in order to get to a zero balance budget by statute, and submitted to the board by the first Monday in February. So we could go through a shortened, a condensed version of this brief. I know that the board would like time to discuss priorities and needs.
I think at this time I would open up just to the board if they didn't have any questions that were answered during the finance committee meeting that they need to be able to those priorities. Give them that opportunity to maybe ask questions that we weren't able to ask in the other meeting because of the time limits. So are there any questions from the board on what we just covered in the financial committee meeting before we move on? Mr. Donnelly.
So in the meeting, we had a estimated shortfall of $6.5 million for general operations and $3.5 million for transportation. So coming out about a $10 million gap.
That is correct. We anticipate approximately a $10 million budget deficit next year.
So my question is, the leadership of the district's really been phenomenal in identifying additional funds, worked really hard to do that. Do you have any tricks in your bag of tricks that are left to utilize to close this gap other than simply reducing the number of teachers that we have?
There's a number of things that have come up over the last couple months that we have looked at for increasing revenue. If you look at the way our block scheduling affected OASIS counts and the number of hours of students in school per day, we'll be looking at a very deep dive in that over the next couple of months, because the thing you want to do is increase the full number of ADM, or at the end of the formula, the adjusted average daily membership, during the month of October. We are looking at partnerships with some of the outlying districts that we believe will be revenue neutral, but of course, as programs expand, there's always opportunities there.
And basically, we're looking at every student, and because we have a sharing of resources now that I can take a course here and here, we used to just kind of process that or with schedules, and now we're really going to put kids where they, on paper, and they are there, but we used to just have a kid move, but not necessarily all the paperwork, and we're going to put kids where they are maximized in their funding. So we're going to take a look at every school. How is the funding? Where's the most dollar earned? So if a student is really part-time Eagle or East and part-time a smaller school that would get more money, we're going to ensure and just double check that that child is at those schools appropriately so that we can maximize. So we're doing a really deep dive audit, and it looks to be, not, it's maybe 500,000 to $1 million, but it's still something that we could do that would help us in the long run. So we are being very deliberate with kids that are shared resources across the district.
And a really good example of that would be a student at East High, where it's the largest school of the district by far, that we get a little over 90 cents per student, BSA equivalent at the beginning or at the end of the formula. But if we made sure that 0.25, because they're a part-time at King Tech, which has a much lower school size factor, for that 0.25, they would be getting more money for that one class that they were in at King Tech. Same thing would apply, of course, for Paideia, where you have a correspondence student who at the very end of the formula, in the formula, not the very end, but you get the 0.9 correspondence factor. You don't get all of those other factors combined with that student. If we can get those classes, core classes they're taking at brick and mortar schools, and get that FTA accounted for there, then of course it's at a higher rate. So there are a lot of things that we will be doing with data. The reality is about 88, 89% of all the district costs are personnel. The other roughly 10% is everything from equipment, supplies, contracts, insurance, and other is about a 0.5%. And so, I'm not going to put Mike Fleckenstein on the mic with no notice, but he's looking at switching to smart printing, which means everybody doesn't have a printer at their desk. There's printers that are centrally located where you have to walk to the printer, but then there's other secrets to it, because you could have stuff go straight to the print shop where it's much, much cheaper to print 1,000 copies versus on a color laser printer. The ability to, for instance, me, I sometimes print more copies than I need, or I print it in color when I could have printed in black and white. And the smart printing forces you to go in, put your code in, and then it asks you, do you really need color, or is black and white okay? And did you really mean 22 copies? Mike's estimates about 8 months ago, 9 months ago, it saves districts our size significant amounts of money.
Yeah.
There's a lot of effort to pull this off, but we're looking at quite a few items that normally or previously would have been looked at fixed costs, and trying to reduce what was formerly known as a fixed cost.
And through the president, to add on to this, a couple of years ago when we started centrally with a little bit more of smart printing and limits, we've changed our offices around here first, and it is a savings, but in our schools in a district our size, it's upwards of over $1 million, just under $2 million. However, it's going to take a lot of socialization. Similar to our schools, you change a parking lot flow for parents, it's a big change. You take away the ability for an employee to have a printer of his or her own. It'll freak some people out. So we have to really socialize the benefits, cost analysis, the efficiencies, using technology, so that change will be over. Because if we just took it away, people would just feel crippled to teach because they've had a routine so long. But it really is a slick system where it's a double check.
And I have a perfect example at the very beginning of looking into smart printing. Mike's guys looked at all the color copies printed by school by size and did a comparison across the district. One school came out as printing an abnormally large amount of color print copies. So Mike's team went to that school and found out they were printing weekly a 20 or 30 page thing for parents in color because they were keeping the parents informed. They've since switched to more digital and less print and saved significant amounts of money over the course of a year. So smart printing is as much a mindset as it is actual equipment. It's changing the way you operate. And so Dr. Bishop, of course, is absolutely right. That it's big. You've got to change the way people think about what happens with that mouse.
Correct. Changing human behavior is difficult. I didn't mean that we would freak out. Sorry.
And just go back to the making sure students are assigned to the one that's the most beneficial school. I appreciate that adjustment of paperwork, but as we talk to legislators, I hope we talked about, you know, we shouldn't really be in a position where we have to do that. A student is a student, and to me, that a student at a school like East is somehow worth less than a student anywhere in our state. That's a concern as far as what the funding formula is going to look like long term. Just to, I don't know, just want to think about that, the equity for students in our district. Sometimes we get this idea that we don't need as much funding or where our needs are different somehow, but a student needs to, you know, a fair education.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, through the president, I would say that the funding formula, the design was to be equitable and think about equity and the cost. And so when you have economy of scale, it doesn't seem to make sense that we're less than even $1 per kid, $1 for dollar, where some school districts are $2.6 to R1. So I would say, and there was an audit done by what's the firm at ICER, that shared that our funding formula compared to lots of many states is actually an equitable model somewhat. They quoted special education as being a deficit there because students at the end of the formula, such as correspondence kids, don't partake in that benefit of CTE, special education gifted, and yet there are gifted kids in correspondence schools. Another issue that our board brought up was it's been over 10 years since the last update, and many states, every 10 years, statutory requirement to redo their cost of living thing. So I wouldn't say that it's so out of, you know, because they treat people differently. I think that the purpose was for equity, and it just now seems so significant because it is the larger districts that are having the biggest budget crunches early. We saw that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we tried to adjust insurance. We saw it coming down the line that the rate of our increases in insurance is unaffordable. The small school districts were 5 years behind us, and initially the talk was very different between rural. They said, no, we want to keep it because we can attract people this way. And we're like, we can't. So I think we just are about 5 years earlier of feeling all the fiscal crises, more so than our Bush partners, but they will down the line if this continues. Every part of that, those issues that we just feel them first. I would say, in my experience, larger school districts do.
Any other board members? Okay. Mr. Donnelly.
How long will it take to develop a plan to reduce the $3.5 million gap in available funding and versus actual transportation costs? That would, and the plan could include changes in boundaries, school boundaries, longer distances being required before this busing would be available, and any other variables like that that might be recommended by the transportation experts?
Well, to start, it won't be quick. We recall the Mount Spur discussions when we talked about Mount Spur. There will be a lot of community input and feedback for changing bus routes. It will take some time for transportation to rework some courses of action. I would suspect early next semester, we would be able to socialize some potential options and opportunities. I think we will be in development of the budget before a decision could be fully discussed through the community and to reach a final consensus. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't move forward. I would just be surprised that you can make that significant a change in a 2 to 3 week period.
Ms. Hildy?
And just for my understanding, that transportation gap was created after the statutory change to bus driver pay? Is that there was no gap before?
It occurred as a result of, they paid a certain amount per student, and then they came out with a law that increased the salaries of all bus drivers, or at least the minimum salaries of all bus drivers. But what didn't change was the amount per student allocated toward that
so we were
mission.
left to make up that difference from our teacher pool, basically.
It was really built in by design, even if it wasn't intentional, yes.
Mr. Donnelly?
So to refocus on the $6.5 million shortfall on general operations, other than transportation, how much of that is related to the expenses that are going to be incurred with the new contract, the tentative agreement contract with the AEA?
It's really spread across the whole general fund. I don't think you could tie any of those individual dollars within a deficit to any one contract. Costs are increasing in utilities and medical, and it really is broadly spread out.
But the cost of the contract, too, is around $22 million spread over the next 3 years. The first year being this year, and the next being, the first year being this year, and then the second year being next. So the pro forma is looking at the 2 years of increases. So that's roughly, $7 million a year. Not all of that goes into the general fund. Some of that's going to be out of grants. So we're looking maybe 10 to 12 million of probable increases based on that, and then a reduction of some amount due to the reduced calculations on PTR having less students. The pro forma has 56 FTE reduction based on 1,400 less students over the current year's adopted budget. So we do have an increase in cost from the contractual side, and then a reduction on FTE.
Just one thing. Since we haven't, are we okay to talk about this even while they're voting?
I believe so. It's a public TA.
Okay.
We did use as an assumption that the tentative agreement would be approved. I believe the voting goes through 5 o'clock tonight, although Ms. Haldane could, or Ms. Jennifer could correct me. I don't know if she changed her last name, so I'm now really confused.
She didn't.
Sorry, Jennifer. I think we can discuss it, but until we get the results, it's a discussion that's our assumption.
Mr. Foster?
If I may follow up on Table 4 of the Pro Forma Financial Outlook Appendix, where we have the salaries and wages by account codes. Table 4, page 9. So that includes the enrollment decline and the salary and wage and compensation increases across all of the
That's correct.
personnel services.
And within those state functions of 100, 200, 220, 300, and 350.
So if I wanted to isolate Board Member Donley's question, what's the impact of the tentative agreement that's included in this pro forma? What's the total number dollar change from 1819 to 1920?
I believe I'd have to come back with go back and look at our notes on the production on it, because all of these state functions generally include other bargaining units as well. TAs within instruction, special education TAs, security and support. So it's not all teachers in all these functions. So it's not really fair to say all this increase is based on just the AEA contract, but we could certainly bring back the amount that's built in.
I think that would be helpful, like to get a sense of how much of the increase is related to that. Thank you.
Any other board questions? Okay.
So last year, we did not take the bulk of a work session to make sure we get feedback from the board as we get ready to start the bargaining session. Although we had a lot of discussions and we had months of talking about it, thought it was appropriate, knowing that we're walking into what some of you are experiencing now is a multi-year deficit and having to make some really tough calls. I thought we could spend some time to get input from each of you as to where you would like us to look at. We will compile all that. And then as we start the budgeting process, we'll come back as an administration with a recommendation because quite honestly, very difficult to make everybody happy when you start with a deficit and you have to get to zero. So much better to at least get a feel for what are those areas that really we've got to hold that until the last minute if in fact a cut has to be made or recommended.
Ms. Hildy.
You're asking for what we'd like to see in the budget?
What would you like to see in the
As a
budget?
priority.
What would you like to increase in terms of capacity or resources? What areas you would feel more comfortable in accepting risk? Mr. Foster brought up during the Finance Committee meeting the discussion as to whether we would look at assuming additional revenue and a legislative focused messaging to get money focused on Eagle River schools. That's a good example. Things that will help us say, okay, these are our assumptions, and it looks like broadly the board agrees on these areas, or broadly the board agrees on other things, or even specific board members. And then we'll try to sort the dominoes and come up with
I would
the
say
best we
my
can.
overriding focus is lowering class sizes. We talk about the need for counselors. All of those go into lower class sizes. If I have a class of third graders and I have 5 kids who have some extra challenges versus a class with 3 kids with extra challenges, suddenly my day goes very differently. How you can teach kids, how you can meet the needs of those kids, and suddenly they're able to participate in the class more. And then you can meet some of the more social emotional learning aspects that a counselor might otherwise provide, but lowering class size captures all of that, and I think it captures what parents are concerned about as well.
So I just want to be careful, and even though it's individual board members that might have that concern, it really needs to be more than one board member that supports that. So, any other board members? Okay, you want to?
Madam President, to meet that goal, that it's a whole board discussion for the work to go back to us. As the discussion continues, we could take notes and then at the end, before, report it back and then have some discussion by the board in continuity and what you'd like to move forward with in direction for administration.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Donnelly?
So looking at it from the other direction, last year I proposed reductions in the number of assistant principals, and I would like that to be considered again this year, especially at those schools that already have more than 2 assistant principals.
Mr. Holloman?
And I know things got delayed by a little bit of disruption in the past week, but we are assuming that the TA is passed. We're discussing mid-level schedule changes within a committee. I assume they'll come up with something that costs something. And are there any parameters going in, or any estimates, or? I know there may not have been any work done yet.
Thank you. There was a meeting that occurred that actually a board member attended the meeting. Notes were taken. It was just kind of grounding and rules. I sent a little note on it yesterday. The AEA as well as administration did agree to postpone. If the plan, we aren't assuming that it's an increase in cost. The suggestions would come back. Some might not. We don't know. This is really organic. We understand what people want, but we'll bring that back to the board, and then certainly it's the board's discussion. So then that would be built in as well, depending on what as a unit you'd like to see. But we don't, our group, I think on both sides are going in with, coming up with a solution, and then it'll be priced out whether it's more expensive or it could be less expensive. I mean, who knows? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Before you, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Foster, did you have something?
I'm happy to wait.
Okay, Mr. Donnelly.
A few months ago, I had asked for copies of organizational charts with funding designations, and I realize that's a big ask because it's a complicated process. I know it existed at one time, but it needed to be updated. I'm still very interested in that going into the budget process, to be able to identify possible locations that I could support personnel reductions.
Roger, we could also sit down with you and go through the budget book, which does go school by school, department by department, with total FTE and the amount, and we will when possible look at actual organizational charts in a different format.
Mr. Foster?
Thank you. I think there's an opportunity to reduce class size in Eagle River that will be broadly supported, and I would like to encourage our collective consideration of that initiative and making adjustments in our revenue projection to accommodate that specific ask. I do think there's another opportunity that is related to class size, which basically says even if we are projecting an enrollment decline, let's assume that we want to hold our staff levels approximately level, and as a result, reduce class size in aggregate across the district would be a secondary way to get at some of the class size issues. And I think those would be relatively modest and relatively easy sells compared to other years where we've tried to go for those specific kinds of items. If we talk about teachers in classrooms, I think those two sort of thrusts have some potential. The other one I offer up, not as a budget process, but as a consideration collectively. I frequently get asked about how come our test scores are not the same as Florida's. I smile and look at the Florida class size amendment that went into their constitution a long time ago. And it may be worthwhile for us to prepare a schedule that shows just how small their class sizes are compared to ours. I think that's a very sobering comparison, and it helps takes the wind out of some of the criticisms that we get if we look at the amount of resources we're being given and the expectations that at least some folks have. Thank you.
Are there any other comments from board members? Okay, I'm going to say mine. I still believe, even with lower class sizes, that I would like to see an increase in counselors. I know we have that. We're going to gain about $500,000 from Mount Spur. We have, is it 7 schools without counselors, or are we down to 6? Okay, 7. I'd like to see at least 4 or 5 counselors, because I know what you're saying, Ms. Hildy, but that doesn't keep our kids. Our kids are still coming with a lot of trauma, and we don't, when a child has to wait 2 weeks when they have an issue to speak with a counselor, somebody that's trained in this, I think that's a detriment to our students, and so that would be my ask. Mr. Donnelly.
So I'd like to better understand the numbers that were used to calculate the reduction in teachers that this budget, this proposal reflects based on the fall in population that's projected. We know that over the past 2 or 3 years, the projected decrease in population has been inaccurate by quite a bit. That there were hundreds of more kids didn't come into our schools than was actually projected by the folks doing that projection. A few months ago, when we talked about this, there was some talk of them adjusting how they were calculating that based on their failures over the past 3 years. And does this budget reflect a new calculation, a new projection based on a revision and how they calculate that? Or is this still based on the numbers that we were told about 6 months ago?
I can talk that. So we did look at Northern Economics formulas, and they were already somewhat complex. But when we kept them the same, and we used the data that they used to collect, which was really PFD data, birth rates across Alaska, and then other normal trends that we get from the city and the state. They projected something like a decrease of 170 something next year. And that was a baseline as you look at their formula and their metrics. So we found a couple things, or they found a couple things. One, we've included housing, which our board president had discussed last spring and through the summer about how she had seen rental vacancy rates and a decrease in home sales and some other items. When they included that in, then they went further, dug into the formula, and there was in the 4th grade class, it took into account the PFD data from when the student would have been like 4 years old, but it didn't take into account somewhere in the formula for the changes between that age and the prior school year. And so once the formula was cleaned up, it came out to a little over 500 less next year than this year. Now, when we look at the amount of job losses in Anchorage over the last several years, the percentage decrease in the last 12 months has decreased significantly. We're not at the bottom, and when we talk to Neil Freed, he's seeing the same thing across Alaska. But when you look across Alaska at job losses, the job losses really were or have been centered, because we're the largest population, really in the Anchorage area. But between what he's given us and Bill Popp, who's got a lot of smart guys at Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. Really, it does look like this is the year that it's still decreasing, but we're getting closer to balancing out before there's potential for economic growth. The rate of decline is considerably smaller than it has been the last several years. So when we look at a decrease in students from about 700 and something this year, and last year a significant amount, it does make sense when you look at job losses have slowed, the economy becomes more stable. 500 is still a lot of students less, but it's not at the rate we've seen in the last couple of years. It does pass the common sense test, although I have no crystal ball.
So does the projections that we've been provided, is it based on the 500 reduction or the 170?
The 500. Okay. And it's by school, by grade, across the district, with some modifications for AMCS and some other stuff, but yes.
Ms. Hildy?
And I'll just say, I share Member Marsette's concern on counselors. I think for me, it's which do you put in the first slot versus second slot, and what do I think is functionally, when I visit classrooms, what equips teachers to do their job best? And I think you could get 100 different answers for that. I think there's subtle differences. So I, also support counselors.
Let me see. Mr. Foster, did you have anything? Okay, Ms. Donder.
As long as we're putting in plugs for specific areas, I want to maintain at least our current level of security. And just so people out there know, I think we have something like 40 security officers or personnel now that's being paid through the general fund.
Mr. Holloman, do you have anything? Okay, Ms. Hildy?
And just because Jim asked on the potential, the risk aspect of budgeting for something based on our current levels of staffing or something, I think we talked a little bit in the budget meeting, just needing more information, but open to that possibility. So that's where I would be at on that.
Anything else? Mr. Johnley? Sure.
We did some major reductions to sanitation personnel last year, and before we looked at any additional reductions there, I'd really like a very reliable analysis of whether our schools are maintaining, we're continuing to be able to maintain the sanitation and safety on the level of cleanliness in our schools. I know you guys have been working on that real hard to absorb those reductions. But it was one of the top things listed by parents in the survey that we conducted to make sure the schools are clean. And we all know how difficult it is with small children if they pick up some sort of flu or something in a school and bring it home.
No other comments? Ms. Hildy?
And just on transportation, while we talked about closing that whole gap, maybe we don't have to close it, but if there's an area to look at just to reduce it a little, that's a subtle step in that direction. Maybe even just some of the shared services that we already have, moving in that direction. It doesn't have to be the whole thing.
Okay, I think, thank you. Not too big of a list.
It's cake.
Yeah. Good, I'm glad to hear that. So I do want to take our full 30 minutes for new business, because I have a few things, I'm not sure if anybody else does, which would mean, Mr. Donnelly, we have 10 minutes for Q&A on the math, and I know that we've pushed it off once again. Would you mind if we pushed it off one more time?
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess pushed off isn't the right word, but.
Could I just ask, could we just ask if there was anybody here on that subject? Because I wouldn't want to push it off if somebody.
Oh, sure.
But I can do it anytime.
Oh, Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. So I do want to take some time to talk about new business. One of the, and I'm going to ask board members first if they have anything, because I've got a few housekeeping things and then one thing I'd like to bring up. And then we have the bond, too, that we have to talk about. Mr. Donnelly.
The governance committee is going to take up, I'm very interested in the retention policy amendment that I've offered, and it's going to be taken up now, not this month, but in January by the governance committee. So I just want to make sure that's continuing in process, because I really think that's really important.
Ms. Hildy?
Yeah, and thank you. I just wanted to ease up our committees this month, but we will have that ready for next month. And then I wanted board member feedback on looking at our vacancy policy, on how we fill vacancies. We had talked about that previously, if there needed to be any policy adjustments. Is that something people want to review in the coming months? And if so, to start thinking about it, and any changes or lessons learned to that policy?
I think it doesn't hurt to have the discussion, have the discussion and then determine from that discussion whether there's any further need. Anyone else? Okay, very quickly, I had a couple of things. We are getting ready. They've just put out the notice through Alaska Association of School Boards that they're taking registration for the fly-in February. And I would like to know if this is when our students go. And I need to know if there's any board members that would like to go to that fly-in February. Dina Mitchell will have to go in April, because that's when they're having the board meeting. And so we must attend the one in April. I'd like to have different board members attend the one in February, but I don't know if there's anyone that can do that. Okay, well, think about it, and if you could let me know as soon as possible, I'd appreciate it, okay? The other one is we have been asking about the national conference in March, and we haven't heard back from anyone. Is there anyone, that's in Philadelphia, is there anyone that's interested in going to that conference?
I'm interested, but at this time, I just can't plan that far ahead.
Okay.
There's too many variables going on.
When do we have to register by? Do you know, Katie? I'll check into it. Okay. I think it's pretty soon. The other thing that I wanted to ask for permission for, if no one else would like to go, because Dina and I are both on the state association, and we have put in for a Magna Award that we're hoping we get. If no one else would like to go, I'd like to ask the board's permission for Dina and I to go. Yes.
One aspect of my choosing not to go is a financial aspect. If I don't have a benefit, so I want to capture that savings of, what would it be taking somebody else's travel budget, or would it?
We have one travel budget, and it just comes out of that travel budget, and it's not a big budget. I mean, we're not talking.
But our board policy is one out of state a year.
One out of state, and that's the reason I'm.
Right. So given how much we want to keep, our budget moving toward that, I would be inclined to hold to our policy.
Well, if we do receive the Magna Award, I would.
What is the Magna Award?
The Magna.
It's an award of some of our programs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We haven't heard back yet, so.
So maybe revisit it if we hear
Yeah.
back.
Okay.
Or somebody else might want to go that's not here.
Right. Any other board comments on that? Okay. So the other thing is, I don't know when our bus presentation is. I know that they're having a meeting tonight on the, I just called the Busbourne site. But when does the board get that information?
I was just going to say that Robin Ward is, I believe, on the agenda for the 17th of December to provide an update to the board, and as the board president mentioned, the planning and zoning is going to receive that recommendation this evening, and the district does have representation, just to be ready to answer questions if needed.
And can you confirm that the recommendation was the land behind the current police department?
I can confirm that the land behind the police department is the correct lands. It's referred to in the study as Site 27. The site that seems to have the most controversy, which also would work, is Site 18. That's not being recommended. So it's the site behind the police department, 27.
Just for the record, I did go to the University Community Council, and they are up in arms, so there will be some testimony from that community council because they're saying where it is now and all these years, the diesel fuels, and we're going more to diesel buses. So anyway, that's a conversation that we'll probably have at that time. Yes, Mr. Donnelly.
Could you clarify that a bit? They're concerned about Site 27 or
Yes.
18?
Well, they've been concerned about where the bus barn is currently, and so they were hoping with the move, it would move further away from their area, because they are saying that they do get diesel fumes in the morning, and it has affected health concerns for individuals that have lung, and so their concern is, of course, Site 27. Because it's not moving it that far away from where it is. However, I've looked at that, and the site actually moves further back, I believe, and up a little bit. So it'll affect me now, and not them, hopefully. But anyway, I just wanted to give the board a heads up on that because that was part of the community council. The other thing that I had that I wanted to maybe get a report on is the free breakfast and lunches at our Eagle River schools. And I realize that there maybe is some complications with getting those delivered to the kids. It sounds like it's a little more work than just saying put the meals on a cart or whatever. So if we could kind of maybe get a report that says when will those be available. The other thing is they are on a free fruit program where they get fruit twice a week. Is that being delivered?
Madam President, we received information from the principal, and we're working through it, so we can, would you like a report done in the Board Connect by this Friday?
Yeah,
or-
that
okay,
would be nice.
We'll do that.
Would that be okay with other board members? Okay, I think it's,
So we just received this as well, so
Yeah.
we'll get it.
yes.
It's not, is it a lot of time on you to put that together?
We're going to have to work on it anyway, so we'll
Okay,
put
so
together.
it's just an
yeah.
update on what
Next
you're
Friday,
doing.
though. We'll catch up. The Board Connect is getting quite large because we've skipped it for
Yeah.
2 Fridays now, but we'll hit it and
So just
briefly
sharing it
just-
after
yeah.
you've done it.
Yeah,
That's great.
thanks.
Thank you.
And just more explanation is we have Homestead and some of the other schools really don't have a lot of children getting free lunches, but with Eagle River coming over, they have several students, like probably 100 or more, that get free lunches and breakfast, and so those aren't being able to be delivered, not just because of logistics, but there's more to that. And so I just kind of want to update, and then they are part of a free fruit program where they get fruit that can go into the classrooms. So I think that's important. All right, so let's talk about, unless anybody has anything else, was there any other housekeeping we had? Okay. Let's talk about the bond, please. And Tom, do you want to start us off, or?
I certainly can, and I do understand that there is sentiment on the board, and believe me, I certainly think it's appropriate if you look at, I've got that, Jim. So if you look at, what we anticipate, some of the capital costs will be significant. But I do want to share, if I might, we do have language back from bond counsel, which I frankly would submit is incredibly liberal, and I think that does lend to this discussion about whether or not we, as a district, or if the board does move forward by adding an amount to the what was approved back on the 26th of November, which is really tied to debt retirement. So I quote this from bond counsel: "Notwithstanding the foregoing, the school district is evaluating the impact of the recent earthquake. As a result of structural assessments following the earthquake, structural repairs necessary in order to meet life, health, and safety concerns will take precedence over the projects. And if the school district shall determine that it has become impractical to accomplish any portion of the approved projects by reason of changed conditions or needs, including the impact of earthquake damage, incompatible development, or costs substantially in excess of those estimated, the school district shall not be required to accomplish such portions and shall apply bond proceeds as set forth in this section." So that gives the board, frankly, the authority to direct funds to where the board determines there is need based on the earthquake damage. So we've kind of kicked this around. I mean, our thoughts are, I mean, and I think there certainly is sentiment within the community that they would support that requested increase. But the other thing that we don't know, and I'm happy to discuss in more detail, that we haven't gotten into these schools. So we don't know. We know what we've repaired. We know what those immediate recovery costs have been from our general contractors and our own folks. But we don't know if there was more extensive damage. So we have schools that we've identified. We prioritized where we see a need to go in and do a much more detailed assessment with structural engineers, with architectural engineers to understand what that recovery effort might be. And as an option, a consideration would be that, you know, we would make notice that once we know, we would go back to the community potentially in the next bond year with a more informed proposal on the projects that we know we need to. And again, a lot of this, you know, there are decisions that may need to be made about some schools. So I'll happily pause at this time.
Ms. Hilding?
My only concern about adjusting prior bonds that have already been approved to use for earthquake is we talked about building community trust. We talked about using funds as voters approved them for, and that's part of why we have this bond that we chose, was to build community trust. So even though it's a good use, of course everyone agrees, is it the best thing to just go back in and say, but we really want to take this that was allocated for a project to use for an earthquake, versus going back next year and saying, here are our earthquake-related needs. I would just be very nervous to reallocate prior bonds to a project that it wasn't bonded for.
And if I might, just to comment on that very briefly, we did go back and evaluate the projects that are on the bond, and really the only project I think is moot at this point is the roof replacement project on Eagle River Elementary School. The others are still viable. But I think the other thing that, and I'll ask George to talk a bit more about it, you know, what we've not really discussed is, you know, we are likely to see a pretty significant amount, you know, if we spend now, that a significant portion of that money will be reimbursed from the state, either through state grants or from federal grants through the FEMA process. So, George, if you would.
Certainly. So we're going through a pretty lengthy process right now, and we've been in communications with FEMA as well as with the state. And our first submission of just our best rough order magnitude goes to the state on Friday. And what that does is that allows the state to take those numbers, and everybody understands rough order magnitude, that there's many more issues out there that aren't being captured in that. But it allows them to take that plus from Matsu and the municipality itself and go forward with a number. If they meet a certain threshold, which is, I believe it's about 25 million, then they're eligible for a declaration of disaster. With that, FEMA funds become available. FEMA comes down, and then they'll basically go through our facilities. They'll look at the documentation that we have. They'll also work with the state. Our pass-through comes from the state. So the state, basically, we go to the state goes to FEMA. FEMA basically allows whatever they're going to allow, comes back through the state to us. There's going to be at least 3 more meetings there's one coming up next week with state and folks from the district. There'll be a couple with the FEMA folks once a disaster declaration is met. The way the funding stream works is the state, if FEMA comes on board, the state provides about 25% of the funding reimbursement, and the feds will provide up to 75% of eligible costs. And what Tom's folks are doing right now are basically documenting costs. Finance has got the responsibility for it, and they're getting all the costs associated with what we've done thus far and rough estimates of what it might take. But as Tom mentioned, we've got a couple of schools out there that we know that there's some structural issues, and it'll take some time to sort through that and get hard numbers. So that's the process. I think that the staff is doing a real good job of accounting for what's being spent and what's projected to be spent.
Mr. Donnelly.
Yeah, I just wanted to understand Member Hildy's concern here. You mentioned projects, having a language that would affect projects that have already been approved. Are you concerned with this language being included into this future bond proposition, or were you talking about somehow that language being retrospective? Because so I wasn't really clear on.
My understanding was that the language would affect existing bonds if, like,
No.
so it would only be for this upcoming bond?
It'll be for these upcoming bonds, and all the folks, when they go to the ballot, when they go to vote or when they get their mail-ins, it will be, that disclaimer will be on there.
Okay.
That's what they're going to be voting
No,
for.
that's
So
great, as long as it's clear, that's
Yeah,
my,
it's
I
clear.
mean,
It's
So
gonna be clear.
you don't oppose including that language for this particular package?
no, I
Okay,
just don't
all
want
right.
voters to be, confused.
I get it.
Mr. Holloman.
I like the language and appreciate it, and of course things could change between now and April. But I actually think most voters would as well. The mood in talking to people that aren't normally enthusiastic supporters of the Anchorage School District and the money we spend shifted with the ground a little bit. And what I've gotten is a lot of respect for the work that's been done and overall how things stood up. And granted, there's some exceptions to that. But I think explaining to people that we're not going to be locked into spending money on something that may not be a wise disbursement of funds just because you approved it is sound. And at least the mood that seems to be out there at the moment, people would be receptive, and I think they would treat it as a responsible thing to do.
So I have a question. What about, we do have funds that we haven't used from other projects. Are those funds that we can ask to be used towards earthquake repairs?
I was just going to say, Dr. Bishop did contact the deed commissioner early last week and requested through him that the district get some relief on the strings that were attached for use of that money. He had indicated, and Dean, I'll allow you to elaborate on your conversation, but he seemed very supportive of that request. At this point, we've not received any definitive response back from DEED.
And with our concern, if that does happen, we can certainly put that out there and let the public know that those funds that are left over from past projects, that we'll be using them through the permission of the state for earthquake repairs. Okay. Mr. Donnelly. Okay. Any other comments or questions from other board members? Mr. Foster.
Just wanted to follow up on George's point. FEMA will reimburse up to 75%, so we don't know whether we'll get the full amount or not, so that's an uncertainty of eligible costs. So there's clearly some items that we might be wanting to do with the opportunity to refurbish, rebuild, repair, renew, given the opportunity of a mobilized construction force on a site. So it does strike me that there's at least going to be a non-zero additional requirement beyond what we'll get reimbursed. So I'm going to offer for the conversation to leaven it and maybe focus it, rather than having the Eagle River Elementary School roof replacement as the package, to have basically approximately $10 million for Eagle River Schools repair, refurbishment, and I would add, I think we want to have space in there for renewal. So there may be some additional work now that you're in there that may be programmatically related. If you're going to get into mobilized, let's do it once rather than doing it twice over the time horizon. So I think that's the sort of interest I want to put forward for us to consider.
So I just want to make a quick announcement. We are under contract. And I want to say thank you to all staff. Oh, we're not?
Madam President, they voted to approve their side of it.
Okay.
We would be under contract when this board.
When we, right. So,
Yeah, yeah.
I got excited.
Yeah. So the TA was
Approved by AEA. Okay.
Correct. They still have their executive folks, but it's pretty perfunctory. If their members vote, then they'll vote.
Okay.
So, yeah, but it's good news.
Okay, sorry, I got excited. I was like, oh my God. Sorry. Can I let Ms. Holder go first, please?
So, Mr. Foster, are you asking to adjust this bond proposal to change the Eagle River Elementary School to just Eagle River Schools and increase it by $4 million?
Correct.
To amend the bond proposal. Is that something we're still in a window for?
But do we know what Eagle River Elementary needs at this point?
We do not. And George, you can correct me. I think we have latitude to modify the project, but for us to go back and increase the amount would necessitate we go back to bond council. Is that correct? To get.
So bond council wrote the current language, and they're the ones that inserted the clause regarding the earthquake. If we change anything whatsoever on this bond language, it has to go back to bond council. And as you know, they're in Seattle, and normally they're given a 2-week time frame to be able to do their thing. Sometimes they've done it faster than that, but I guess from my perspective, if we ask for money right now directly for Eagle River, are we selling ourselves short when we find out what the true scope of the problem is and what that dollar amount is, and then we go back to the voters again with another number? Is that what we really want to do, or do we want to go ahead and clean up what we can now, get a real good assessment of what it's going to take to fix out those schools out there, and then go back with a bond specific to that? And I think, to my mind, that resonates a lot better.
What's the schedule on that, George? Be frank about the schedule.
Well, the schedule is that we wouldn't be able to do any construction regardless for some time, because quite frankly, we've got to do an assessment. Even with that, we still have to go through and deal with the FEMA and the state, right? But even dealing with FEMA in the state, it'll be some time before we know exactly what we have to do with a couple of those schools. Greenig, for example, and Eagle River Elementary School. And there's others. And we have others throughout the city as well. So I guess my only concern is that, yeah, everybody is clued in right now. We had an earthquake, there's sympathy, et cetera, but we haven't gone out and said, look, we're going to fix everything that's out there. All we're saying is that we want to have the latitude in this bond to be able to fix those things that we can fix right away, and then do a real good assessment of what we really need for those schools. Because we've got structural issues and everything else, so that we've got to deal with.
But adding the money doesn't preclude any of that. And what it does do is it gives you resources sooner for this summer or the next cycle. If you wait for a bond proposition another cycle, by the time you sell the bonds, you're quite a ways out. I think we have run a risk of not being able to capture resources sooner to address the issue sooner. That's what I want to understand what the trade-off is.
We've got the money right now.
Yeah, and if I might just to offer, I think if you look at it from another timing perspective, and I'll use Eagle River Elementary School. Why not? So I would surmise that the repairs are going to involve a significant amount of architectural, design and engineering to bring that school up, and that we are out of the emergency procurement business now, so everything is going to be competed. So probably the soonest, if we were to use, fund balance to do this, it would take us some time. Best case, if we were to be ready, we've got a fairly short construction window. Planning and design by this summer, we're probably looking at construction earliest, no matter what fund source, would be not this summer, but the summer following. So I think from a timing perspective, this bond money were to go forward to the voters and they approved any increase, any amount, it's not going to be available to us until after April at the earliest, which puts us outside of any kind of window for design, certainly for construction to repair that school.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to weigh in. It strikes me that the cycle is you get the bond proposition passed in April, you go to a bond sale in the fall, typically. That might adjust depending on market conditions. But at that point, now you have money for beyond just design. You get money now for, you can begin on construction activities. If you wait a whole cycle until next April, then you're in a space where you're going to do a lot of reallocation to address the challenge. And I think you have a communication challenge if you're doing a lot of reallocation within your budgets relative to what you put out on the table. I think that's the trade-off I see, and I'm a little bit worried that you get further and further down the line, you're going to be exposed to that communication challenge of all the reallocations that you've done.
Since the current president was elected, I think many people will recall the bond market was a little chaotic right after the November 7th election a couple years ago. The city switched to a May-June timeframe for sales. They anticipate this year also having a spring sale, depending on any, really large market change in the spring timeframe. But it does appear that the city has now shifted to a spring sale versus a December sale. And because it takes so long for them to pull it together, it really is once a year. I suspect for the next couple of years we'll be seeing spring bond sales.
Ms. Hildy.
In addition to voters, being responsive to the earthquake, I remember the West Romig earthquake. The bond came. It didn't get on right away, and voters remembered, oh, that's from the old earthquake. I don't think anybody's going to be forgetting the damage done to our Eagle River schools or other schools. So I think we'll still be able to capture that. It's not a big sell to say this is the results that we've analyzed and here's an accurate number of what we really need. And I think that's a key factor, having an accurate number of, value of what needs to be done.
Mr. Donley.
So, Tom, the language that you read earlier that was recommended by the bond council, is that already included in this proposal here so that we don't need to make a separate amendment to incorporate it?
That is in the assembly ordinance that is moving forward to the Anchorage Assembly for their approval.
So remind us again of the timeline of having to present this, because I think that also has an impact on whether there are any changes or not.
So we have forwarded the ordinance and Dr. Bishop signed the assembly memorandum. We have forwarded that to the city clerk. The introduction to the assembly will happen on the 18th of December, so that's their first look, and then their second look, when they will most likely act on the proposal, will be, I'm trying to remember the date in January. It's right after, day after our board meeting. It's like the 8th of January. It would be there when the assembly will vote on it.
Board members? Any other questions or comments, or? Ms. Hilding?
I'd just like to be clear. So we're voting on this bond. We already voted on the bond. So why are we looking at it, I guess?
If I may. I think you have a choice to make an adjustment as a board to your proposition that goes to the assembly. Absent that, I think you could share with the assembly a sentiment about whether you want to make an adjustment at their level, or going forward you don't want them to make any adjustments because you feel like you want to wait and do this next cycle. And I want to encourage your collective consideration of making an adjustment now to capture the opportunity that it presents so you can get more resources mobilized sooner.
How does the assembly make an adjustment?
What we present to the assembly, they get to review and approve. We could basically put forward to them a resolution that says, given the changes that have occurred in our capital requirements, we believe that an adjustment could be made at their level, so we don't delay or ask for any sort of additional bond council requirements, that it goes on the assembly rather than us to do that work, so you're in their time frame.
We do have this as a placeholder on action items. If we want to do any of those things, or pass the language that we've talked about, correct?
Well, you've already approved it.
Right, but
so
I mean, if we want to make it.
If the
right.
board wants to modify the language, then.
Right.
So the language is already in it's a municipal ordinance. It's not going to be part of our bond proposal. But the assembly would just take our bond and say, we want to add 10 million to it? Is that something they can do? Is that what Mr. Foster I guess?
No, I have not recommended anyone add 10 million.
No. I'm just saying, for example, I guess I don't understand the procedure you're suggesting.
I believe we're under extraordinary circumstances, and I believe you would find the assembly will be favorable to an adjustment if we collectively encourage them to consider that, and it wouldn't require any adjustment in the schedule.
Mr. Donnelly?
So to just clarify, where we're at right now procedurally is, if we take no action tonight, then the package that we approved with the new language from bond council moves forward.
Right.
Okay. Right. That's what I support doing at this time, because I think within the $55 million, I think there's a lot of leeway with that additional language from bond council to utilize it how it's best needed for the earthquake response also.
Concur, but I do worry that you're going to collect a lot of communication challenge associated with that reallocation, and you could get ahead of that.
So at this time, we don't have to do anything if we want this to move forward. If we want to do something and make any changes or recommendations, then we have a placeholder on action items to do that. And I guess at the time of the meeting, I will just open that up and.
That, or if you decide not to, you can just adjust.
Yeah, if we decide, yeah,
The agenda,
right,
you can
right.
just remove it.
Okay, so I'll ask that question at the time of the meeting. Okay. Anything else? Anybody have any new business, anything they want to discuss? Okay. I think we're a little early, aren't we? Okay, we'll take a, yeah. Oh, yeah, Mark, let's talk about the math, and yeah, sounds good.
So, the question, as I understood it, that was being researched by our staff was the question about Saxon math with regards to Go math in the elementary. And for those who aren't familiar with that, we have 4 schools in the district who are currently users of the Saxon curriculum. And Saxon curriculum is a mathematics curriculum that has a slightly different approach. My elementaries used it when I was elementary principal. How it's different is that it's very much a review type program that circles small items every day over long periods of time, so that the reviews are spread over long periods of time. And on the back of each paper is a section that the parents can look at the front page and see exactly what was happened, flip it over, and they can work off the back. And so that's a little different philosophy. 4 of our schools that use it are Aquarian Charter, Birchwood ABC, Eagle Academy Charter School, and Northern Lights ABC are the 4 using Saxon. So to do this study, we went and took 4 schools that were matched for EDS, economically disadvantaged students, and other factors like gender. We took those and we tried to match them up. Now, this was not a matched student study, so we didn't take each student and find an identical type student with the same characteristics. It was a matched school study. So the 4 schools that were studied that came within 1 or 2 percentage points of those markers, those demographic traits we were looking for, were Bear Valley, Rabbit Creek, Huffman, and Bayshore were the 4. So we took those 4 schools and then we ran comparisons based on 2 things. We looked at MAP scores and we looked at PEAKS scores. So for the first one, there was a statistically significant difference in the MAP scores, and statistically significant just means that it wasn't random. It just means it would probably really happen. There probably really was a difference, at least statistically. Doesn't mean it's important. Sometimes there are differences that are very statistically significant. In other words, they're not random, but they may not be large enough to be important. So there's issues that you have to look at that go into a lot of things. But looking at the MAP scores, there was a statistically significant difference in the MAP scores across the grade levels. And in that level, on the MAP assessment, Saxon math scores were consistently a little bit higher than the Go math. Now, we haven't done studies yet as to the effect sizes, which is another way of saying, well, what's the magnitude of difference? Is the magnitude of difference large enough that we should get excited about that or upset about that, or should we do something different about that? That's a different question. But we do know statistically that there is a difference on that one. However, the interesting part was the opposite was true. There was no statistically significant difference on peaks. So it wasn't clear if it was random or not, the difference. The actual mean scale score of the 4 control groups, if you want to call them that, the ones that were non-Saxon math, those schools, those scores, the mean scale score was slightly higher than those who have Saxon. Now, those are different assessments. If we really wanted to get serious about that study prior to the next round of math adoptions, we'll want to dive deeper into that. So there was a difference on MAP, not a difference on peaks. So there are a few things that probably cause that. One of those is that MAP is a test which is computer adaptive, so it will take the students into higher and higher material, whereas PEAKS is a grade level specific assessment. So students can't, if I'm a third grader taking the PEAKS test, it's not going to move me over into fourth, fifth, and sixth grade material. So I can't show how much I really know like I can with MAP. So it's possible that the difference, what we're assuming, is that some of those differences between those are because there's some highly advanced learners at those 4 schools that have been exposed to or accelerated possibly, or who knows? Those are hypotheses that we'd have to look deeper into. But I know there was some question on the part of the board to know how Saxon Math is performing differently than Go Math. And at this point, probably not enough for us to know, although clearly with MAP, it shows a difference. With PEAKS, it did not.
Ms. Hilding?
I appreciate your efforts, Dr. Stock, but given our limited comparison group, I don't think comparing schools where the students had parents opting into those schools can be compared at all to neighborhood school programs. We don't have a significant sample size. And saying what works for which curriculum, I mean, we could do a calculated assessment where we say, 2 control groups and then see how the students do better, but this doesn't tell me anything. And
no, and I wasn't trying to
no,
make
and I'm not suggesting that to
Okay.
you. I'm just saying I want we can't analyze a program on such a small scale and get meaningful results. So it just doesn't tell us anything, especially when we have such different schools with such small samples.
So, and I would concur that there's other questions that have to be asked, and that was one that we talked about today upstairs with folks, is that that's an assumption that we would have to look at and make, and I don't know what kind of research you do to prove that, but if you matched by EDS and by all these other functions and you did a matched school-to-school study, and 4 are randomly signed only by their geographic location where their parents purchased homes, and the others are lotteried in or choice programs, do different kinds of people choose those programs for themselves? Those are questions that people would have to ask, and they're fair questions. But I don't have an answer for that.
I would just be very concerned of us as a board trying to do this kind of analysis where we're not doing quality analysis. This is just saying, well, what happened in such a small sample size, we're getting misleading information. Whether it's good and supports what we want it to say or doesn't support what we want to say, it doesn't make it fully useful, and I don't want us to be doing this kind of analysis. If we want to analyze a program, it needs to be either a blind study or it needs to be a larger sample size, but this kind of approach isn't going to give us any useful information for making policy. I believe Dr. Stock and his team did a great job with what they felt requested of them, but I don't want to be going down this road.
So I'm sorry, Dr. Stock. My concerns have been that the new math program doesn't cover the basics like multiplication, that teachers are having to supplement that to do multiplication and division and adding, how you do those little 1-minute sheets or whatever. So I'm wondering if that, I know specifically, I know several that have said their children weren't getting that. And I know my grandson personally, it wasn't until 5th grade that he finally caught on. The other thing is somebody had asked me why they skip around in the chapters, that we don't just follow the book. And so I just thought I'd ask that question.
Well, Madam President, and to the rest of the board, the answer to that question is a group, and whether it's the right thing or not, I don't know, but I can tell you that those decisions were made in previous years by the teachers, and their attempt was to try to follow some of the Common Core cycle that goes through and also take a look at some of the current state testing at the time. Sometimes people will have to move some of those things into different order based on things like the time the test is given at the state. So if there's something on the assessment, we haven't got to it in the textbook yet, we'll teach it out of order because we want our students to be exposed to it prior to being held accountable for it on an assessment. So there's reasons like that. I wasn't in the meetings to know what all the rationale was, but those decisions were made by the teachers who worked on those academic plans at the time. Okay. And I can just say in closing on it that these type of little things that we do, these data, they don't really answer questions. They're not designed to. What these little studies do is they create more questions. And so then you decide if you need to go further Do we need to go? There is a difference. What that difference is attributed to, no one here is prepared to say. We're not going to say if it's curriculum. We can't say if it's the teachers. We can't say if it's the effects of the school or the effects of the families or parents. Those are other questions that would have to be asked. So we would not make a curricular decision on that small of a sample, but it was really worth studying, and it's worth looking at. And so we did learn a little bit from it, and I think it'll give us more to look at for later. Math is our next big thing on the agenda as we move off of elementary language arts and middle school language arts.
I just thank you very much. This is exactly what I was hoping to just get a little snippet of, a glance at the question. So I really appreciate you going back and doing this. And because we are coming up on the math curriculum review issue, I just, I don't have the list in front of me, but I just point out that Bear Valley, Rabbit Creek, Bayshore, and Huffman are some of our top performing schools that are not using Saxon math. So I think this was a tough, a very challenging control group to compare the 4 that are using the Saxon math too.
Ms. Hilding?
I just want to reiterate that the question we ask matters. And so going into this question saying which of these curriculum is better based on the small sample size gives us misleading information. So while we say we can have another question, I in fact don't think it leads us to a viable question. If we want to say schools that opt in and schools that opt, neighborhood schools, that's another question, but you have to be very careful in the questions you ask. And I mean, you could ask that same question and you would get these same results, right? Those are 2 different questions. You would get the same results if you looked at math scores, but one's asking curriculum, one's asking that. Maybe one of them is some other random factor. It matters the question we ask, and I don't want us to start doing bad analysis. And not that Dr. Stock's analysis is bad. He did a thorough analysis of what he chose, but how we review those processes, how we make our decision.
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
then how do you want to start?
So
This
you're
was just the
asking
very
how
first
you-
question I asked
Right.
over a year ago, and the first 2 responses were not to the point. Now this is directly on point. It's a sampling that they did the best they could. So I don't understand why you're so concerned about
And
just
I'm
getting a very
concerned,
initial
yeah.
snippet of what it is out there comparing these 2. I don't get what the problem is at this point. We're not going to draw a massive change from this little bit of data, but it's just the beginning point of collecting data. So what is so wrong about that?
Ms. Hilding?
I would say what's wrong about it is that it starts us down a path, and that is the real concern, is how do we analyze what our curriculum is doing? And if we're going to say we're going to take a sample size here and a sample size here, and then say we're going to be able to make a policy decision on it, it needs to be viable analysis, right? Clear, in-depth analysis. And if that becomes our practice, then what kind of results do we have to work with as a large district? There are ways for assessing curriculum. I'm not a curriculum director by any means, but I know in that process you go through, you assess curriculum before you choose it. I'm far more convinced by those assessments than whether something at 4 schools happens to fit in these 1 year of information. That doesn't tell me as much information.
Mr. Foster?
I would be interested to see a recommendation from the administration with respect to what kinds of studies should we do to compare different curriculum going forward. And I'd be particularly interested if we have the capacity to do studies that get beyond school effects and look at student populations and compare student populations as best as we can match those. Because I do worry, having looked at some data over the years on performance within the district, that I think some of the school size effects are material to the consideration, and we want to be very cautious about those. So I'd very much look forward to your recommendation in those areas.
Mr. Stock?
Yes, and this has been it's been interesting because the question is do we have the capacity, and for what types of studies do we have that ability? Our capacity is growing. We do have, I mean, not in terms of numbers of people, but the hires that we've made recently in those departments come in with some background at the university level and have the ability to do some of these analysis, which are growing. So I've sketched out a model of some things that, with everything that happened, I was planning on meeting with them this week, and with all the events, that didn't happen. So, but I am scheduling a meeting with the assessment and evaluation team to look at those things, how we might increase our abilities to ask those types of questions. These type of studies, there's nothing wrong with doing them. What's wrong was when people would make assumptions beyond what the data tells us, which I think is what Member Hildy's concern would be, that we might overreach on something like that. But this is where you start. And so we did answer the question that Mr. Donnelly asked for. And it didn't take us very long. It was not an overly involved thing that Mrs. Tix did, Carolyn Tix did for us. So,
Well, I think you guys are already on the right track. I mean, you're already asking the questions, and when you're looking at your assessments, that's just part of what you're going to be doing as far as reviewing any other curriculum, is looking at those assessments and how valuable are, and do we need to make any changes, correct?
correct.
Okay. I think as far as Mr. Donnelly's question, I don't think that was a question to change any policy or do anything. Mr. Donnelly, am I correct?
We are going to be going into this because it's a regularly scheduled
Right.
review of the math. And so I wanted to get some sense, if there was a way to do it,
Right.
of how Saxon was comparing to Go Math. I don't think it had ever been done before. It's certainly not a definitive study or a definitive indicator of what to do, but I do think it was a valuable exercise, especially since we're coming into a scheduled review of this material.
But just based on that review, we wouldn't need, we need more information. Okay, I think we're all in agreement. And thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think we're ready to, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Donnelly. Okay. Oh, okay. All right, I think we're ready to move to our most important thing. Well, not most important, but the one thing I like the most.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and especially Service High Cougars. Would the boys Service High School swim dive team please come forward? We'll have you guys introduce yourselves. I'm going to talk about you for just a brief moment. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's Focus on Staff and Students. This is a time where we honor the people in our district who make ASD great. And these gentlemen certainly are some of those folks. So, these Service High School boys won state for the first time in 21 years. The last time Service High won state swim dive, none of these students were ever born. Yes. All right. Congratulations, gentlemen. The Cougars set 2 relay state records and won 4 individual event state titles. The boys also set 7 school records to go along with the relay victories, which you will then see their names in their gym, I assume, correct? Yes, they will have a banner into eternity until maybe another 21 years. And with only 6 finalists at the meet, the service team was able to outscore all opposing teams and clinch the state title. The victory was a group effort led by senior captain Caleb Law and sophomore Brian Drarupicorn. Ooh. This was a truly remarkable season, and it will always be remembered. Your principal's also here if you'd like to come forward and celebrate with these gentlemen, or he's going to tweet you out tonight. Congratulations on your state victory. Your hard work and dedication paid off, and you are who make ASD great. And I'm going to turn the mic over to your captain, A lot of you? Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over. I would like you to share your name, your grade, and a thought about this or your school or whatever you'd like. You made history, gentlemen, so here you go.
I'm Austin Carpenter, and I'm a senior this year, and it feels really good to be like in the group that won state for swimming in the first time in 21 years.
I'm Caleb Law, and kind of the same thing he said. It feels really good to be on a team with these great guys that won state for the first time in 21 years.
I'm Nicholas Price. I'm a sophomore, and it feels really good to have Ben. We were the first team that he's coached that's won state for boys, and so it feels really good to represent him.
Hi, I'm Aiden Kenna. I'm a senior, and it just feels really good to do something that hadn't been done in a long time.
I'm Tabner Wisdom. I'm a sophomore, and I guess I'm proud that we won state. And I think because I'm a sophomore, we got a few more years, so we can probably do it again.
My name is Ian. I'm a senior, and I'm just really proud that we have this great team that we can swim with, and yeah, that's what I'm good about.
Hi, I'm Ethan Kwan. I'm a junior, and I'm just happy that I get to train with these guys every single day, even though it's painful.
Hi, I'm Brian Rubicorn, and I'm just happy seeing Ben's face after we won.
I'm Ethan Bartz, and I'm just proud to be a part of this team that won state for the first time in 21 years.
And these jokers, who are all very happy and proud, are also excellent students. I think team GPA was over 3.8, so congratulations, guys.
At this time, would Matt Davis and Jared Heaston come forward? You may have seen these gentlemen from Chugiak High in the paper already. Let me share that these two high school seniors did everything they could to save a stranger after an automobile tragedy on the Glen Highway. Tuesday started out as just a, quote, normal day. The previous day's snowfall had covered the Glen with ice, but traffic was moving along at close to normal speeds as Matt's red Chevy Silverado approached the top of a rise at South Birchwood. As they crested the hill, all Jared could see from the back seat were brake lights and vehicles sliding. Matt and Jared got out to check on the occupants of a vehicle that had crashed behind them. Further down the median, a woman driving a 2001 Dodge van had collided with a Toyota Ram, or RAV4. Toyotas aren't Rams, sorry. Police said the driver of the van got out of her vehicle and was trying to get away when she was hit. We didn't even think about it, Davis said, as they ran to help the woman who had been struck by the vehicle. Both teens have first aid training. Heaston is a lifeguard, and Davis took CPR as a freshman at Chugiak High, and they figured it was just their duty. In reflection after the accident, Jared shared, "Your normal day can turn into something else just like that. It taught us that life is precious." Good job, guys. Sorry. It is. Okay. The last sentence says, "Thanks for your selfless kindness, support, bravery, and willingness to help. You make ASD great."
And I'm sure you're going to be much more eloquent than me and hold it together. So would you like to say a few words? And congratulations to both of you for your bravery.
I appreciate that. I'm not the best at giving speeches. I actually don't know what to say other than how south a day can go without you knowing. So ultimately, don't get out of your vehicle if you get into a crash. That's the best I can say.
I'm not great at giving speeches either, but all I can say is, like I said, your day can turn real quick, and it's scary. But I'm glad me and Matt were there. I guess it was just a time for us to do what we can and just lead. So.
Thank you, gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our focus on staff and students. Thank you for making ASD great.
I move us into executive session for the purpose of personnel and student negotiations.